The autumn of 1894 had settled upon London with unusual severity, bringing with it a persistent fog that transformed the great metropolis into a labyrinth of shadows and uncertainty. For nearly a fortnight, the sun had been but a pale memory, and the gas lamps of Baker Street struggled to pierce the ochre gloom that pressed against our windows like some malevolent spirit-seeking entry. Within the comfortable confines of 220 Abbey, however, a different sort of darkness had taken hold. My friend Sherlock Holmes had fallen into one of those periods of restless melancholy that alternated so strangely with his moments of brilliant activity. For 3 days he had prowled our sitting room like a caged predator, his keen mind starved of the intellectual stimulation it craved. The violin lay neglected upon the mantelpiece, and even his chemical experiments had been abandoned in favor of a brooding contemplation that filled our chambers with an almost palpable tension. I found him that morning draped across his armchair in his mouse-colored dressing gown, staring fixedly at the ceiling with an expression of profound dissatisfaction. His long, nervous fingers drummed an irregular rhythm upon the arm of his chair, and the familiar blue reek of his tobacco hung heavy in the air. "The criminal classes of London appear to have entered into a conspiracy of virtue, Watson," he remarked, without shifting his gaze. "It is enough to drive a man to distraction. My mind rebels against stagnation as nature abhors a vacuum." "Perhaps," I suggested, laying aside my medical journal, "this period of quiet should be welcomed. Surely even you require rest occasionally." Holmes made a sound that was half laugh, half snort of derision. "Rest, my dear fellow, is merely another word for mental decay. The brain, like any fine instrument, deteriorates more rapidly from disuse than from the most strenuous application. I require problems, Watson. Give me the most abstruse cryptogram, the most intricate analysis, and I am in my proper element. But this," he gestured vaguely toward the fog-shrouded window, "this is merely existence. The summons from Scotland Yard." Our lethargy was shattered by the sharp clatter of hooves upon the cobblestones below, followed by the urgent ringing of our doorbell. Holmes straightened instantly, the languor vanishing from his frame as if stripped away by an electric current. His grey eyes, which moments before had been dull with ennui, now gleamed with sudden interest. "A client, Watson," he said, cocking his head to listen to the heavy footsteps ascending our 17 stairs, "and one in considerable distress, if the irregularity of his tread is any indication. Official boots, leather soles with metal reinforcement, and he pauses twice on the landing, not from fatigue, but from the weight of what he must tell us." The door burst open to admit Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his ferret-like features more pinched than usual, his thin frame trembling with what appeared to be a mixture of excitement and bewilderment. His coat was damp with fog, and I noticed that his usually immaculate appearance showed signs of hasty dressing. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began without preamble, "I need your help with a case that has left us completely baffled. The commissioner himself suggested I consult you immediately." Holmes rose with fluid grace, his entire demeanor transformed. "You have been awake all night, Lestrade, and you come directly from a crime scene in the northern districts. Hampstead, I should say, judging by the particular quality of clay adhering to your boots. The case involves a young woman, and there is something about the circumstances of her death that defies conventional explanation." Lestrade's jaw dropped in astonishment. "How could you possibly know?" "Elementary," Holmes interrupted with a slight smile. "Your appearance tells the story plainly enough. But pray, take a seat, and tell us what has brought you here in such evident distress." "The impossible crime." The inspector settled himself into the wicker chair, clutching his hat with hands that trembled slightly. "We have a murder, Mr. Holmes, but not like any I've encountered in 20 years with the Yard. A young woman, Miss Evangeline Ashford, aged 22, was found dead this morning in her private studio in Hampstead. The cause of death, Holmes inquired, settling back into his chair with the focused attention of a hawk watching its prey. Strangulation, Lestrade replied grimly. Manual strangulation, according to the police surgeon. The bruising on her throat indicates considerable force was used. And what makes this case so unusual that it requires my attention? Lestrade drew a deep breath, as if steeling himself to relay information he himself found difficult to accept. Miss Ashford was found seated at her easel, slumped forward over a painting she had been working on. The studio was locked from the inside, door bolted, windows latched and painted shut for winter. There was no possible way for anyone to enter or exit that room after it was secured. A locked room mystery, Holmes murmured, his eyes gleaming with interest. Tragic, certainly, but surely within the realm of conventional investigation, unless— He leaned forward slightly. There is something more, is there not? Indeed there is, Mr. Holmes, and it's the most disturbing aspect of the entire affair. Lestrade's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Miss Ashford was an artist, a painter of considerable talent. When we found her, she was working on a canvas that depicted herself. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. A self-portrait? Not exactly, Dr. Watson. The painting shows her own studio from her perspective at the easel, but in the background, clearly visible in the reflection of the mirror on the far wall, is the figure of a man with his hands around her throat. Holmes sprang from his chair with such sudden energy that both Lestrade and I started. Extraordinary. She painted her own murder as it occurred? It appears so, Mr. Holmes, but that's not all. Written in paint at the bottom of the canvas, in her own hand, are the words, "I watched him leave through the locked door." The artist's final testament. Holmes began pacing the room with quick, nervous steps, his mind clearly racing. This is remarkable, Lestrade. A victim who not only witnesses her own murder, but documents it for posterity. Tell me, what was the condition of the paint when you found her? Still wet in places, according to our examination. The police surgeon believes she lived for several minutes after the initial attack, long enough to complete the painting. Fascinating, Holmes murmured. And you say she wrote that she watched her killer leave through a locked door? Yes, sir, which is impossible, as you well know. The door was bolted from the inside when we broke it down. The windows were sealed. There was no other way out of that room. Holmes stopped his pacing and fixed Lestrade with an intense stare. Has the identity of the man in the painting been established? We believe so. Miss Ashford was engaged until recently to a Mr. Marcus Whitmore, a gentleman of good family but questionable character. The engagement was broken off 3 months ago under circumstances that were acrimonious. The figure in the painting bears a strong resemblance to Mr. Whitmore. And has this gentleman been located? That's another peculiarity, Mr. Holmes. Mr. Whitmore left London yesterday morning, claiming urgent business in Edinburgh. His landlady confirmed he departed on the early train, but Lestrade hesitated. But a witness saw someone matching his description in Hampstead yesterday evening, not far from Miss Ashford's studio. Holmes rubbed his hands together with evident satisfaction. Excellent. Watson, fetch your coat and medical bag. We must examine this studio before any further contamination occurs. Inspector, you have presented us with a case that promises to be one of the most singular in my experience. The journey to Hampstead. As our hansom rattled through the fog-shrouded streets toward North London, Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his sharp features illuminated intermittently by the passing gas lamps. I knew better than to interrupt his thoughts, but I could see his mind working behind those keen gray eyes, already beginning to construct the framework of possibilities that would eventually yield the truth. The impossible situation, Watson, he said suddenly, breaking his silence, is the siren song of our profession. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. But in this case, we are presented with multiple impossibilities that must somehow resolve into a single, coherent explanation. The locked room certainly presents difficulties, I agreed. The locked room is merely the stage, Watson. The true mystery lies in the performance. A dying woman who not only observes her killer's departure, but takes the time to document it with artistic precision. There is something here that transcends the merely criminal and enters the realm of the theatrical, an arrival at the scene. The studio occupied the ground floor of a converted carriage house in a quiet residential street in Hempstead. Even in the fog, I could see that it was an elegant neighborhood, the sort of place where artists and writers might find both inspiration and respectability. A small crowd of curious onlookers had gathered at the garden gate, held back by a constable who looked relieved to see our arrival. As we approached the building, Holmes's trained eye took in every detail of the surroundings. Note the gravel path, Watson. Recently raked, but there are footprints leading to and from the studio entrance. Multiple sets, some quite fresh despite last night's dampness. Inspector Lestrade met us at the studio door, which stood slightly ajar, its wood splintered around the lock where it had been forced. We had to break it down this morning when Miss Ashford's maid became concerned. The bolt was shot home from the inside, and the key was still in the lock. Holmes examined the damaged door frame with his magnifying glass, paying particular attention to the bolt mechanism and the surrounding woodwork. "The bolt was certainly engaged," he murmured. "The scratches on the metal and the resistance patterns in the wood confirm it. This door was definitively locked from within." We entered the studio, and I was immediately struck by the atmosphere of creative industry that pervaded the space. Canvases lined the walls, easels stood at various angles, and the air carried the distinctive scent of oil paint and turpentine. But dominating the room was the easel positioned near the large north-facing window, and upon it the painting that would prove to be Miss Evangeline Ashford's final work, the artist's last canvas. The painting was extraordinary in its clarity and detail, despite the circumstances under which it had been created. It showed the studio from the artist's perspective, with meticulous attention to the placement of furniture, the quality of light, and the reflection in the mirror that dominated the far wall. And there, captured with disturbing precision in that reflection, was the figure of a man with his hands positioned around the throat of a woman who was unmistakably the artist herself. Holmes approached the canvas with the reverence of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript. "Remarkable technique," he observed, producing his magnifying glass. "Note the brushwork, Watson. Confident, deliberate strokes, despite what must have been extraordinary circumstances. This was not the work of someone in the throes of panic or delirium." At the bottom of the canvas, painted in small but clear letters, were the words that had so disturbed Inspector Lestrade. I watched him leave through the locked door. She had time not only to observe her killer's departure, I marveled, but to document it with such precision. How is such a thing medically possible? Strangulation, when applied with the intent to subdue rather than immediately kill, can result in a period of consciousness before death occurs, Holmes replied. Our killer may have intended to render Miss Ashford unconscious, only to have her revive in time to witness his departure. The question that concerns me more immediately is how he managed that departure through a door that was indisputably locked from the inside. Holmes turned his attention to the room itself, examining every inch of the floor, walls, and ceiling with methodical precision. The windows were indeed painted shut, their frames showing no signs of recent disturbance. The chimney was too narrow to admit a human form, and the walls showed no concealed passages or openings. "Inspector," Holmes said finally, straightening from his examination of the floorboards near the easel, "you mentioned that Mr. Suspense Whitmore was seen in the vicinity yesterday evening. What time was this observation made?" "Shortly after 9 o'clock, according to the witness, a local shopkeeper who was closing his establishment." "And the estimated time of Miss Ashford's death?" "Between 9 and 10 o'clock, based on the condition of the body when we found her this morning." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then knelt beside the easel, examining something that had caught his attention. With his tweezers, he carefully extracted a small object from beneath the painting stand, a single button, made of horn and bearing the distinctive pattern of a gentleman's overcoat. Our phantom visitor was not quite as immaterial as he wished to appear, Holmes murmured, placing the button carefully in an envelope. Watson, I believe we have seen enough here for the present. Inspector Lestrade, I shall require a detailed description of Mr. Sieyes, Whitmore's appearance, as well as the address of his lodgings. This case promises to be a remarkable illustration of the principle that there is always another way, if only one knows where to look for it. As we prepared to leave the studio, Holmes paused at the threshold and turned back to regard the painting one final time. "She was extraordinarily brave," he said quietly, "to maintain such presence of mind in her final moments, to leave us such a detailed record of what occurred. Miss Evangeline Ashford has provided us with the very clues we need to bring her killer to justice. The promise of resolution." The fog was beginning to lift as we made our way back toward central London. But the mystery of the locked studio remained as impenetrable as ever. Holmes sat in contemplative silence during the journey, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic pose I knew so well. "You have a theory already, don't you?" I ventured as our hansom turned into Baker Street. "I have several theories, Watson, each more improbable than the last. But as I have often observed, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Miss Ashford has left us a remarkably detailed testament to her final moments. It remains only for us to read it correctly. And you believe you can do so." Holmes's grey eyes glinted with that familiar fire of intellectual challenge accepted. "I am certain of it, my dear fellow. The game, as they say, is afoot, and this particular game promises to be one of the most fascinating we have yet encountered. To be continued in Part 2. Alibi. The following morning broke clearer, though a persistent amber haze still clung to the chimney pots of Baker Street, softening the harsh angles of the buildings opposite our lodgings. I discovered Holmes already ensconced at our breakfast table, his angular frame twisted in the Windsor chair, a neglected cup of tea growing cold at his elbow while he scrutinized the official police report with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. A yellow telegraph form lay beside his plate, weighted down by the heavy crystal salt cellar that had belonged to his grandmother. "You are precisely 23 minutes late, Watson," he observed without lifting his gaze from the documents. "Mrs. Hudson's kettle whistled at 7:15. Her footsteps upon the stair followed at 7:18, yet you descended only at 8 o'clock. You have been engaged in correspondence, medical correspondence, judging by the faint scent of carbolic upon your sleeve. I sent word to my practice," I admitted, settling into my accustomed chair. "Your summons yesterday allowed no time for proper arrangements with my patients." "Your dedication to your profession is admirable," Holmes replied with that familiar half-smile, "though your handwriting betrays you. The fresh ink stain upon your right cuff, the slight indentation upon your forefinger from prolonged pressure of a steel nib. These small details proclaim the conscientious physician." He gestured toward the telegram with a long, pale finger. "Here, however, we encounter something far more intriguing. Lestrade has been remarkably efficient in his preliminary inquiries." I accepted the flimsy paper and read aloud. "Whitmore departed Euston 9:05 yesterday morning, first class Edinburgh. Ticket collector porter, remembered distinctly. No record return. Landlady confirms departure. Witness Hampstead insists saw Whitmore 9:30 evening near Ashford studio. Impossible reconcile. Require guidance. Lestrade." "It appears our Mr. Whitmore possesses the remarkable ability to be in two places simultaneously," I observed. "Unless the witness is mistaken about the identity." Holmes rose and moved to the window where weak November sunlight struggled through the grimy panes. "A question of identity, my dear Watson, is rarely as straightforward as the authorities imagine. A particular cut of coat, a remembered gait, the angle at which a man wears his hat, these details can conjure phantoms from the fog. Nevertheless, the coincidence demands investigation." At that moment, Mrs. Hudson appeared bearing her silver salver, upon which rested a calling card of expensive stock. Holmes glanced at it and passed it to me with raised eyebrows. Mr. Leonard Ashford, I read. The victim's brother, I presume. Indeed. Show him up immediately, Mrs. Hudson. The gentleman who entered our sitting room was a man of perhaps 30 years, tall and spare, with the pallor that speaks of sleepless nights and profound grief. His clothing, though of excellent quality, showed the careless arrangement of one whose thoughts are elsewhere. Fair hair fell across his brow in disorder, and his grey eyes bore the reddened appearance of recent tears. There was breeding in his bearing, yet his hands trembled slightly as he declined the chair Holmes offered. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began without preamble, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I have just come from my sister's studio. Inspector Lestrade informed me of your involvement in the case. I pray you will accept my gratitude for undertaking this terrible business." "We are honored to assist," Holmes replied gravely. "Please accept our condolences upon your loss, Mr. Ashford. Your sister demonstrated remarkable courage in her final moments." The man's composure wavered. "That painting, that dreadful testament she left behind. I can scarcely comprehend how she found the strength to complete such work under such circumstances." "You have examined the canvas?" I inquired. Lestrade insisted I view it, hoping I might confirm the identity of the figure depicted. As though there could be any doubt, I recognized Marcus Whitmore immediately. Holmes leaned forward with sudden interest. "You knew Mr. Whitmore well." "Too well, I fear. He was engaged to Evangeline until 3 months past. The attachment was severed when she discovered his gambling debts and other irregularity of character. Since then, he had persisted in troubling her with unwelcome correspondence and occasional appearances at her studio." "Your sister worked professionally as an artist?" "She painted portraits, primarily for ladies of society, who found her manner less intimidating than that of the established academicians. Her talent was beginning to gain recognition. She had recently completed commissions for Lady Caroline Darnley and Mr. Septimus Vale, among others." Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "Tell me, Mr. Ashford, who possessed keys to your sister's studio?" The man hesitated, his features tightening. "Evangeline kept one upon her person always. The other hung upon a nail in the passage outside the studio door, a convenience for the household staff and for clients who might arrive when she was briefly absent. Anyone in the house might have accessed that key?" "I suppose so, yes, though I cannot imagine—" He stopped abruptly, his face flushing. "Mr. Ashford," Holmes said gently, "in matters of this gravity, no detail is too small, no suspicion too delicate to examine. Your sister's final painting suggests she witnessed her killer's departure through a locked door. We must consider every possibility, however unlikely it may seem." Leonard Ashford nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging beneath the weight of grief and terrible possibility. Leonard Ashford remained standing by the fireplace, his fingers gripping the mantelpiece as though it alone prevented him from collapsing beneath the weight of his grief. The morning light, filtering through our grimy windows, revealed the toll that sleepless hours had exacted upon his features. His fair hair fell in disorder across his brow, and his grey eyes bore the reddened appearance of recent tears. Yet there was steel beneath the sorrow, a determination that spoke well of his character. Holmes observed him with that peculiar mixture of sympathy and clinical detachment that characterized his approach to human emotion, acknowledging its existence while maintaining the objectivity necessary for rational analysis. "Mr. Ashford," he said gently, settling into his chair with deliberate calm, "I understand this is a most trying time, but I must ask you several questions that may seem intrusive. The circumstances of your sister's death are sufficiently unusual that we cannot afford to overlook any detail, however seemingly insignificant." The young man nodded, drawing a shuddering breath that seemed to steady his resolve. "I understand completely, Mr. Holmes. Ask whatever you must. I want nothing more than to see justice done for Evangeline." "You are convinced of Mr. Whitmore's guilt?" Holmes inquired, his keen eyes studying Ashford's reaction. "Who else could it be? Evangeline painted him in the very act of strangling her. What further evidence could possibly be required?" The words came with bitter conviction, yet I detected an underlying uncertainty that suggested the man's logical mind wrestled with the same impossibilities that troubled us. Holmes reached for his pipe, beginning the familiar ritual of filling and tamping the tobacco. Evidence, Mr. Ashford, is a curious thing. What appears to be incontrovertible proof may, upon closer examination, prove to be something quite different. Tell me, when did you last see your sister alive? 2 days ago, at dinner. We maintain separate establishments. I have rooms in Bloomsbury, but we dined together regularly at her studio. She seemed in good spirits that evening, speaking enthusiastically about a new commission she had received from Lady Pembroke. Did she express any concerns about Mr. Whitmore or any other person? Ashford's jaw tightened perceptibly. She mentioned receiving another letter from Whitmore the previous week. She destroyed it without reading it, as she had done with all his correspondence since their engagement ended. She told me she was determined to put that unfortunate chapter of her life behind her. He paused, his expression growing troubled, though she did mention something else. She believed someone had been watching her studio in recent weeks. Holmes straightened with sudden interest. Watching her? In what manner? She said she had noticed a figure loitering near the garden gate at dusk, always slipping away when she approached the window. At first she thought it was Marcus, but when I questioned him, this was before their final quarrel, he denied it with considerable vehemence. Yet you did not consider the matter serious enough to alert the authorities? Ashford's face flushed with what appeared to be self-recrimination. My sister possessed a vivid imagination, Mr. Holmes. She was accustomed to dramatizing ordinary circumstances, as artists sometimes do. I fear I did not wish to add fuel to her apprehensions. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. God forgive me. I should have taken her fears more seriously. Holmes struck a match and applied it to his pipe, drawing deeply before speaking through a cloud of aromatic smoke. You must not blame yourself, Mr. Ashford. However, I am troubled by certain aspects of this case that do not align with the theory of a simple crime of passion. Watson, perhaps you might share your medical perspective on the nature of the attack. I had been considering this very question since viewing the body in the studio. The strangulation, while certainly violent, showed a degree of control that is most unusual. The killer applied sufficient force to render Miss Ashford unconscious, but not immediately fatal pressure. This suggests either remarkable self-control during a moment of rage or a specific intent to incapacitate rather than kill. Precisely, Holmes agreed, his grey eyes gleaming with that familiar fire of intellectual challenge. A man in the throes of passionate fury rarely exercises such restraint. Moreover, we must consider the locked room. How did the killer depart through a door that was indisputably bolted from within? Leonard Ashford's expression grew increasingly troubled. I confess I have been unable to reconcile that particular mystery. Inspector Lestrade suggested that perhaps Evangeline herself locked the door after her attacker fled, but surely she would not have possessed the strength for such an action. An excellent observation, Holmes said approvingly. The medical evidence suggests she had perhaps around 5 to 10 minutes of consciousness after the attack, but in a severely weakened state. The act of completing that painting would have required all her remaining strength and concentration. The idea that she then rose, walked to the door, and secured the bolt strain's credibility beyond all reasonable limits. Then how? Ashford began, but Holmes raised a hand, silencing the question. That, my dear fellow, is precisely what we must determine. Now, I require some additional information about your sister's household arrangements. Who else resided in or had regular access to the carriage house? Only Agnes Pierce, the maid who has served our family for 6 years. She occupies a small room on the upper floor and manages the household duties. Her character is beyond reproach. She has been with us since our parents' death. And her movements on the evening in question? She informed the police that she retired to her quarters at approximately 8 o'clock, as was her custom. She heard nothing unusual until the following morning, when she brought Evangeline's breakfast and found the studio door locked with no response to her knocking. That was when she summoned the gardener to help break down the door. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, adding another layer of smoke to the already considerable haze in our sitting room. You mentioned that your sister had painted Whitmore previously. Could you describe this earlier work? A small charcoal study she made during their courtship. Quite a good likeness, actually. It hangs in her bedroom at the studio. She was rather proud of it at the time, though I suspect she would have destroyed it along with his letters had she thought of it. Fascinating, Holmes murmured, his eyes taking on that distant quality that indicated his mind was rapidly processing and connecting disparate pieces of information. Miss Ashford, I believe Watson and I must return to the studio for a more thorough examination. There are details in your sister's final painting that require closer study. Within the hour, we found ourselves once again in the fog-thinned streets of Hampstead, the afternoon light revealing the neighborhood in stark, unforgiving detail. The studio felt heavy and suffocating when we entered, the scent of turpentine now mingled with the stale air of a room sealed against the world. Holmes immediately directed his attention to the easel where the fateful painting still rested, lifting the police cloth with reverent care. "Observe the brushwork here, Watson," he murmured, indicating the lower right corner where the cryptic message was inscribed. "The letters are formed with a fine sable brush, likely a size 2. The paint is a mixture of crimson lake and ivory black, the same mixture used for the shadows in the background." "Does that signify something specific?" I asked, studying the dark, glistening pigment. "It suggests economy of movement. She used the paint already on her palette, rather than mixing a new color. Time was indeed of the essence. Yet observe the figure in the mirror reflection, the details of the coat, the set of the shoulders. These are rendered with remarkable precision for a dying woman." Holmes began a meticulous examination of the room's perimeter, tapping walls, lifting rugs, and scrutinizing every surface with his magnifying glass. I watched as he paused near a large, heavy wardrobe that stood against the eastern wall, filled with costumes and props used for Miss Ashford's portrait sittings. "This wardrobe," he remarked, opening the doors to reveal a collection of velvet gowns and feathered hats. "It appears quite substantial. Mr. Ashford, does it move easily?" "I shouldn't think so," Ashford replied from his position near the doorway. "It is solid oak, extremely heavy. It has stood in that exact spot for years." Holmes pushed against the side of the wardrobe, confirming its immobility. He then knelt and examined the floorboards beneath its base with his glass. "Most interesting," he murmured. "There are faint scratches here, parallel lines in the varnish, suggesting this heavy object has been shifted recently, though only by the smallest fraction." Leaving the wardrobe, he moved to examine the painting once more, this time focusing on details in the reflected scene. "There is something here that has been troubling me," he said, pointing to a small object visible on a table behind the reflected figure. A vase of white lilies, clearly depicted. Where is that vase now? We looked around the studio carefully. There were several vases, some filled with dried flowers, others holding brushes, but no vase of fresh white lilies anywhere to be seen. "Perhaps they were discarded after wilting," I suggested. "Or perhaps," Holmes said slowly, his voice taking on that tone of suppressed excitement I knew so well, "they never existed in this room at all, Mr. Ashford. Did your sister often paint from imagination?" "Rarely, if ever. She prided herself on absolute realism. 'Paint only what you see,' she would always say. 'Truth is more compelling than any fiction.'" Holmes straightened up, his gray eyes now blazing with that unmistakable gleam of discovery. "Then she saw white lilies, but not in this room. Watson, I believe we must pay a visit to Mr. Marcus Whitmore's lodgings in Montague Street, regardless of his alleged presence in Edinburgh. I suspect his rooms may hold the key to understanding how one watches a killer leave through a locked door." As we prepared to depart, the late afternoon shadows were already lengthening across the garden path. The mystery of the locked room remained unsolved, but Holmes's step was light, his manner that of a man who had caught the scent of his quarry. The impossible was beginning to unravel, thread by carefully observed thread. The afternoon light was beginning to fade as our hansom clattered through the increasingly congested streets toward Bloomsbury, carrying us deeper and into the heart of literary London, where scholars and gentlemen of modest means maintained their quiet existences. Holmes sat in contemplative silence throughout the journey, his sharp profile occasionally illuminated by the gas lamps that were beginning their nightly vigil against the encroaching darkness. His fingers drummed that familiar rhythm upon his knee, indicating the intense mental activity that I had learned not to interrupt during our years of partnership. Montague Street presented itself as a respectable thoroughfare of Georgian townhouses, their brick facades blackened by decades of coal smoke, yet retaining an air of faded gentility that spoke of better days. Number 47 stood midway along the terrace, distinguished from its neighbors by freshly painted railings and an immaculate front step that suggested a landlady of particular fastidiousness. Holmes bounded up the steps with renewed energy, his walking stick rapping smartly against the polished brass knocker. The landlady's testament. The woman who answered our summons proved to be Mrs. Pemberton, a sharp-eyed individual of middle years whose severe black dress and tightly bound gray hair proclaimed her dedication to propriety and order. Her initial expression of suspicion transformed to one of grudging cooperation when Holmes presented his card with a slight bow and explained our connection to the official investigation. "Inspector Lestrade was here this very morning," she declared, her voice carrying the clipped precision of one who prides herself on proper diction. "I told him everything I know about Mr. Whitmore's departure. Left yesterday morning at 20 minutes to 9, he did, carrying his valise and wearing that dark overcoat with the horn buttons, the one he's so particular about. Said he'd be away on business in Edinburgh for a fortnight at least." Holmes's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly at the mention of horn buttons, and I recalled the small object he had discovered beneath Miss Ashford's easel. "You are remarkably observant, Mrs. Pemberton." Few landladies could recall such specific details about a gentleman's attire. She sniffed with evident pride. "I make it my business to notice, Mr. Holmes. When you've had lodgers come and go for 20 years, you learn to watch for the signs. Too many have departed in the night, leaving unpaid bills and damaged furniture. I saw Mr. Whitmore walk to the corner with my own eyes, turning right toward Russell Square as he always did when catching the early train. And you are certain he did not return last evening?" "Absolutely certain, sir. His room remains exactly as he left it, barring the search that Inspector made this morning. If Mr. Whitmore came back to London yesterday, he did not sleep under my roof." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me before requesting permission to examine the absent tenant's quarters. Mrs. Pemberton hesitated only briefly before leading us up the narrow staircase to a modest sitting room and bedroom on the first floor, overlooking the street below. Secrets in the chamber. The rooms bore the anonymous comfort typical of respectable lodgings, yet Holmes's trained eye immediately detected signs of hasty departure. Dust patterns on the shelves revealed where objects had been recently removed, and the writing desk showed evidence of papers hastily gathered and sorted. Holmes moved systematically through the space, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to ordinary observation. "He burned correspondence recently," Holmes observed, kneeling beside the fireplace where charred fragments of paper lay among the cold ashes. With delicate precision, he extracted several partially intact corners bearing what appeared to be feminine handwriting. Cream-laid paper, educated script. I suspect these were letters from Miss Ashford, destroyed before his departure. The writing desk yielded further evidence of Mr. Whitmore's circumstances. Unpaid bills lay stacked beneath a crystal paperweight, alongside racing forms and a stern letter from a creditor threatening legal action. A small silver-framed photograph of Miss Evangeline Ashford occupied a place of honor beside the inkwell, her youthful features radiant with what might once have been love. "Mrs. Pemberton," Holmes called over his shoulder. "Did Mr. Whitmore receive many visitors during his tenancy?" "Very few, sir. He kept to himself mostly, though his habits had become increasingly irregular in recent weeks. But there was one caller about 10 days ago. A rough-looking fellow, not at all the sort one expects to see in a respectable house. Heavy-set, perhaps 40 years of age, with a scar across his left cheek and the bearing of a man accustomed to violence. Holmes straightened with sudden interest. "Did you overhear any portion of their conversation?" Mrs. Pemberton's sense of propriety warred visibly with her curiosity about our investigation. "I may have heard raised voices from the sitting room, something about debts and payment being overdue." Mr. Whitmore's tone was pleading, almost desperate. The visitor left in a rage, slamming the door so forcefully that my china rattled on the sideboard downstairs. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, moving to examine the window that overlooked the street. "This window latch has been recently oiled. Observe how smoothly it operates. And there are faint scratches on the sill, suggesting something has been dragged across it." He opened the casement and leaned out, studying the drain pipe that ran directly beside the frame. "A reasonably agile person could descend to the street without using the front door, Mrs. Pemberton." "I assure you, Mr. Holmes, that Mr. Whitmore departed through the front entrance yesterday morning. I watched him go myself." "I do not doubt your observation," Holmes replied thoughtfully. "However, this alternate exit may have been utilized on other occasions when discretion was required." The crucial discovery. Holmes' attention became fixed upon a small ceramic vase positioned on the mantelpiece, its elegant proportions suggesting considerable value. Though currently empty, dried petals and pollen residue within indicated recent use. "This vase contained flowers quite recently," he observed, examining the interior with his glass. "White lilies, judging by the characteristic pollen and the broad petal fragments adhering to the sides." Mrs. Pemberton nodded with sudden recollection. "Indeed, sir. Mr. Whitmore had a visitor last week, a gentleman named Mr. Sterling, who brought white lilies as a gift. I thought it peculiar for one gentleman to bring flowers to another, but Mr. Whitmore seemed pleased to receive them. The next morning, however, he threw them out, claiming they gave him a headache." Holmes's entire demeanor sharpened with excitement. "Mr. Sterling, you go say. Could you describe this gentleman?" "Tall, dark-haired, very well dressed. From behind he bore a remarkable resemblance to Mr. Whitmore himself. Same build, same way of carrying. Himself. Quite distinguished in appearance, though there was something about his eyes that made me uncomfortable." "And did he provide an address?" "He mentioned residing in Kensington, though he gave no specific location. He and Mr. Whitmore spoke privately for nearly an hour before he departed." Holmes carefully wrapped the vase in his handkerchief, placing it in his coat pocket with evident satisfaction. "Mrs. Pemberton, you have been extraordinarily helpful. Should Mr. Whitmore return unexpectedly, I would be most grateful if you would send word immediately to Baker Street." The threads converged. As we descended to the street and emerged into the gathering dusk, the fog was beginning to thicken once again, transforming the familiar thoroughfares into a maze of shadows and uncertainty. Holmes hailed a passing hansom, his expression grave in the lamplight as he settled beside me. "Watson," he said, his voice carrying that tone of suppressed excitement I knew so well, "we have discovered far more than I dared hope. The horn button connects our absent Mr. Whitmore directly to Miss Ashford's studio. The burned letters prove continued communication despite their supposed estrangement. The rough visitor suggests gambling debts or other financial entanglements that might drive a man to desperate measures." "And the white lilies?" I prompted. The lilies are perhaps the most significant discovery of all. Miss Ashford painted them with perfect accuracy in her final work, yet no such flowers existed in her studio. She painted what she had seen elsewhere, specifically what she had seen in this very room. The connection between her final painting and Whitmore's lodgings is now undeniable. But how does this explain the locked room, or the witness who saw Whitmore in Hampstead when he was supposedly in Edinburgh? Holmes smiled with that familiar gleam of intellectual challenge accepted. "Those mysteries remain to be solved, my dear fellow. However, we now have a new thread to follow, this Mr. Sterling, who bears such a remarkable resemblance to our absent suspect. Tomorrow, we shall make inquiries in Kensington, I suspect we shall find that the impossible departure Miss Ashford witnessed has a perfectly logical explanation once we understand the true nature of the performance she was compelled to observe. The hansom rattled through the fogs, shrouded streets toward Baker Street, carrying us deeper into a mystery that grew more complex with each revelation, where financial Bibeltum, desperation, obsessive attachment, and mysterious accomplices suggested a puzzle far more intricate than a simple crime of passion. To be continued in Part 5. The mirror's deception. The morning brought with it a clarity that seemed to extend beyond the mere lifting of London's perpetual fog. Holmes had risen early, and I discovered him at our breakfast table, surrounded by the previous day's evidence arranged with mathematical precision. The ceramic vase from Whitmore's lodgings occupied the center of this display, while scattered around it lay fragments of charred correspondence, the horn button, and several sheets covered with his angular handwriting. "I have been considering the matter of reflections, Watson," he announced without preamble, gesturing toward the vase with his fork. "Miss Ashford painted those white lilies with perfect accuracy, yet no such flowers existed in her studio. The question that has been troubling me is not where she saw them, but how she saw them." I settled into my chair, intrigued by this new line of reasoning. "You believe she had visited Whitmore's lodgings recently?" "On the contrary, I am certain she had not. Her brother was explicit on that point. She had avoided all contact with Whitmore since their separation. No, Watson, she saw those lilies through reflection, not direct observation. Her final painting is not merely a record of what transpired in her studio. It is an amalgam of two distinct scenes, the immediate reality before her and an image preserved with extraordinary precision in her memory." Before I could respond to this remarkable theory, our discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Lestrade, who appeared at our door bearing a leather portfolio, wearing an expression of mingled excitement and frustration. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began, settling into the wicker chair with evident relief. "I've brought enlarged photographs of Miss Ashford's painting. Our police photographer worked through the night to produce detailed images of specific sections. I thought you might find them illuminating." Holmes seized upon the photographs with evident eagerness, examining each one through his magnifying glass with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient manuscripts. The enlarged images revealed aspects of the painting that had been less visible during our studio examination, the precise details of the reflected figure's clothing, the arrangement of objects in the background, and most significantly, the positioning of the attacker's hands. "Remarkable detail," Holmes murmured, his attention fixed upon one particular enlargement. "Observe the hand placement, Watson. The left hand appears higher than the right, suggesting the attacker approached from behind and slightly to her left. This positioning is consistent with a right-handed assailant, yet there is something peculiar about the angle that troubles me." The witnesses confirmed that Mr. Whitmore is right-handed, Lestrade offered. "Indeed, but we must not allow ourselves to be constrained by obvious conclusions." So Holmes set down the photograph and leaned back in his chair, his gray eyes distant with thought. "Inspector, I require additional information. First, a complete inventory of every object in Miss Ashford's studio, with particular attention to items that might serve as props. Second, the exact dimensions of that studio and the precise positioning of the mirror relative to her easel. Third, any connections Miss Ashford might have had to the theatrical profession." Lestrade made careful notes in his pocketbook. "I can provide the first two items readily enough. As for theatrical connections, I'll need to make inquiries among her acquaintances." "Do so with all possible speed." "I believe we are dealing with a carefully orchestrated deception, one that required considerable planning and theatrical skill to execute." Holmes rose and moved to the window, his sharp profile etched against the morning light. "There is something else, Inspector. Yesterday's inquiries in Montague Street revealed the existence of a Mr. Edward Sterling who bears a remarkable physical resemblance to Whitmore. I believe this gentleman warrants immediate investigation. The Kensington Trail. Our subsequent journey to Kensington proved more fruitful than I had dared hope. The address provided by Mrs. Pemberton, vague though it had been, led us eventually to a respectable florist's establishment near the High Street, where the proprietor's memory proved remarkably detailed. Mr. Edward Sterling. Indeed, gentlemen, I know him well, the small, dapper man declared, his pointed beard quivering with enthusiasm. A most particular customer. Always white lilies, and always from the same grower. 2 weeks passed. He ordered 2 large arrangements and a separate bouquet. The arrangements were for a dinner party at his residence in Inverness Gardens, but the bouquet he carried away personally, claiming it was a gift for a friend. Holmes's eyes flickered with that familiar gleam of discovery. He insisted upon white lilies, specifically. Most emphatically, sir. Always fully open blooms with prominent stamens, though I warned him repeatedly about the staining properties of the pollen. Most gentlemen prefer their flowers less assertive. Armed with this information, we proceeded to Inverness Gardens, where number 12 presented an impressive facade of polished brass and gleaming windows. The butler who answered our summons, a man whose calm demeanor spoke of long service, confirmed Sterling's residence, but informed us that his master had departed suddenly the previous morning. Mr. Sterling left shortly after 8 o'clock with a single traveling bag, the man explained, his composure faltering slightly when Holmes mentioned the police investigation. He said he would be away for several days, but provided no specific destination. Holmes' attention was immediately drawn to a large mirror in the entrance hall, positioned directly opposite the door. You have been in Mr. Sterling's service long? 4 years, sir. During that time, have you noticed visitors who might mistake your master for another gentleman, or the reverse? The butler hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of our inquiry. There has been such confusion, sir. Mr. Sterling bears a considerable resemblance to another gentleman who has called here frequently, a Mr. Marcus Whitmore. From behind, one could easily confuse them. In recent months, however, their meetings became increasingly strained, with raised voices and talk of money and obligations. The theatrical connection. Holmes's request to examine Sterling's study revealed a room dominated by another large mirror, positioned behind the writing desk in a manner that would catch the entire room in its reflection. More significantly, we discovered a portfolio of drawings that made us both start. Charcoal sketches of Miss Evangeline Ashford, rendered with remarkable sensitivity, yet signed E. Sterling. Our mysterious gentleman fancies himself an artist, Holmes observed, studying the drawings with professional interest, and his style bears an uncanny resemblance to Miss Ashford's own work. The butler, peering over his shoulder, spoke hesitantly. Sterling spent many evenings at his easel, sir. He claimed that under Miss Ashford's guidance he could almost pass for the real thing. This revelation sent us immediately to the theatrical agencies near Covent Garden, where hours of methodical inquiry finally yielded results at the offices of Thespian Talents and Services. The clerk, a weary man with ink-stained fingers, recognized our description immediately. "That sounds like Arthur Pendleton," he said, consulting a dusty ledger. "Character actor of considerable skill, but a difficult temperament and mounting gambling debts. He hasn't worked steadily in months, though he did mention recently having found a patron, a gentleman who paid him simply to be seen in certain places wearing certain clothes." Holmes leaned forward intently. "Did he mention the name of this patron?" "Whitmore, I believe. Pendleton thought it a great joke, being paid to play the role of a gentleman. He was bragging in the taverns about coming into real money soon, enough to clear his debts and leave the country. The confession. We arrived at Scotland Yard just as a telegram brought news that shattered our previous assumptions. Whitmore had been arrested in Edinburgh, where he possessed an unshakable alibi for the time of the murder. 3 witnesses confirmed he had been dining publicly at the Royal Hotel when Miss Ashford died. When we encountered Whitmore in Lestrade's custody, the young man appeared pale and thoroughly defeated. Holmes's direct question about hiring Arthur Pendleton brought an immediate confession. "I had no choice," Whitmore whispered, slumping into a chair. "My creditors were closing in, threatening seizure of my assets. I needed time to raise money in Edinburgh, but I couldn't let them know I had left London. Pendleton was supposed to show his face around town to be seen near my club and lodgings. I never intended for anyone to be hurt." "And did you instruct him to visit Miss Ashford?" Holmes pressed. "God, no, never. I still loved her, Mr. Holmes. I would never have allowed that ruffian anywhere near her." The remaining mystery. As we prepared to leave Scotland Yard, Holmes's expression remained troubled, despite the significant progress we had made. "We have solved the mystery of the impersonation, Watson, and identified our likely killer in Arthur Pendleton. Yet the central puzzle remains. How did he escape from a room that was indisputably locked from within? And why did Miss Ashford, in her final moments, record not merely her attacker, but his impossible departure?" The fog was beginning to thicken once again as we made our way back to Baker Street, transforming the familiar thoroughfares into a maze of shadows and uncertainty. Somewhere in the labyrinthine streets of London, Arthur Pendleton remained at large, a master of disguise who could change his appearance as easily as his coat, and who had demonstrated his willingness to commit the ultimate crime. "The game grows more complex with each revelation," Holmes murmured as our hansom rattled through the gathering dusk. "We have our killer, but the method of his escape continues to defy all logical explanation. Tomorrow, Watson, we must return to that studio and examine it not as investigators seeking evidence, but as students of the impossible, determined to discover how our ill-locked Roma might yield its secrets to one who understands the art of illusion. To be continued in Part 6, The Art of Deception. The following morning arrived with a peculiar stillness that seemed to settle over Baker Street like a physical presence. Holmes had been awake throughout the night, and I discovered him in the gros-ore pre-dawn light, seated at our table with the police photographs arranged in precise patterns before him. Empty coffee cups testified to his vigil, and the acrid smell of his strongest tobacco hung heavy in the air, creating an atmosphere of intense concentration that I hesitated to disturb. "The answer has been before us from the beginning, Watson," he announced without lifting his gaze from the images. "Miss Ashford told us precisely what happened, yet we have been too literal in our interpretation. When she wrote that she watched her killer leave through the locked door, she was describing exactly what she observed, but not what we assumed she meant." I settled into my chair, intrigued by this new direction. What else could she have meant? The door was indisputably locked from within. "Indeed it was, my dear fellow. But locked by whom?" Holmes rose with sudden energy, gathering the photographs and thrusting them into his coat pocket. "Come, Watson, we must return to Hampstead immediately. Say, I believe I understand not only how the impossible was achieved, but why Miss Ashford's final painting contains the very evidence needed to prove it." Says Studio The journey through London's awakening streets proceeded in contemplative silence, Holmes's fingers drumming that familiar rhythm upon his knee, while his keen mind continued its relentless analysis. The studio, when we arrived, stood silent and undisturbed, morning light streaming through the north-facing window to illuminate the scene of our mystery with stark clarity. Holmes moved immediately to examine the door mechanism, producing a thin metal probe from his pocket. "Observe the bolt handle, Watson. What appears to be a natural flaw in the casting is actually a carefully drilled hole, barely visible to casual inspection." I peered closely at the indicated spot. "Good heavens, you're right. But what purpose could such a hole serve?" "The purpose of allowing external manipulation of an internal mechanism." Holmes drew from his coat a length of strong fishing line, the type favored by anglers for landing large specimens, a simple but effective method known to the criminal classes, though rarely employed with such theatrical precision. He demonstrated by threading the line through the small hole, creating a loop around the bolt mechanism. If one were to close the door from the corridor, pass the ends of this line through the keyhole, and then pull with steady pressure, the bolt began to slide slowly across its track, engaging with the strike plate with a soft but decisive click. Holmes then withdrew the line completely, leaving the door securely fastened from within with no trace of external interference. Ingenious, I admitted, but this explains only the mechanism. How does it account for Miss Ashford's painting, which clearly shows her killer within the room itself? Holmes moved to the large mirror that dominated the far wall, adjusting its angle slightly. Because she painted exactly what she saw, Watson, but what she saw was not what we assumed. Position yourself at the easel, slumped forward as she would have been in her final moments. I took the indicated position, and Holmes stepped behind me, just out of my direct line of sight. Now observe the mirror. What do you see? In the reflection, I could see Holmes clearly, but more importantly, I could see the door behind him. I see you, and I see the door in the background. Precisely. Now watch carefully. Holmes moved toward the door, and in the mirror's reflection, he appeared to approach it directly. When he reached up to demonstrate the fishing line technique, his white shirt cuffs flashed prominently in the reflected image. From this angle, with failing vision and oxygen-starved perception, what would you think you were observing? The revelation struck me with stunning clarity. She thought she was watching him manipulate the door from inside the room, when in fact he was already in the corridor, securing his escape route. The final deduction. Holmes returned to the easel, studying the fatal painting with renewed understanding. Every detail she recorded was accurate, Watson. The figure she painted was indeed her killer, but seen in reflection as he worked his mechanical trick from the corridor. The white elements we interpreted as lilies were actually his shirt cuffs, distorted by the mirror's bevel and her failing vision. The positioning of his hands, which seemed wrong for strangulation, was perfect for manipulating fishing line through a keyhole. But why go to such elaborate lengths? Because Arthur Pendleton needed to create an impossible crime that would baffle the authorities while providing himself with an unshakable alibi. By ensuring the door was locked from within, he created the appearance that no one could have entered or exited the room. Miss Ashford's painting, which he could not have anticipated, it usually supports his deception, if interpreted literally. Holmes carefully photographed the drilled hole in the bolt mechanism using his portable camera. However, when we understand the true nature of what she observed, her final work becomes not evidence of an impossible crime, but testimony to a clever mechanical deception. She watched her killer leave through the locked door, because that is precisely what appeared to happen from her perspective. He seemed to walk away from the door, just as it locked. Itself, the hunt intensifies. As we prepared to leave the studio, Holmes's expression grew grave with purpose. We now possessed the evidence necessary to prove Pendleton's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. The drilled hole, the fishing line technique, and Miss Ashford's accurate but misinterpreted testimony combined to form an unbreakable chain of proof. Then we must alert Lestrade immediately, I said, feeling the weight of our discovery. Indeed, Watson, but we must move with extreme caution. Pendleton is not merely a killer. He is a master of deception whose theatrical training makes him extraordinarily dangerous. Even now, he may be preparing to flee the country, believing his perfect crime will never be unraveled. We must ensure that Miss Ashford's courage and final sacrifice lead to justice, not merely to the escape of her murderer. The morning had advanced considerably, and the fog was from the streets of Hampstead, revealing the neighborhood in sharp, unforgiving detail. Yet somewhere in the labyrinthine streets of London, Arthur Pendleton remained at large. A man whose intimate knowledge of illusion and misdirection had nearly created the perfect crime. To be continued in Part 7. The actor's final performance. Our return to Baker Street was punctuated by the urgent clatter of hoofs upon cobblestones, as Inspector Lestrade's hansom arrived mere moments after our own. The inspector burst through our door with barely contained excitement, his ferret-like features animated by the thrill of the chase. In his trembling hands, he clutched a telegram that would prove to transform our methodical investigation into an urgent pursuit. "We've located Pendleton's lodgings," he announced breathlessly, thrusting the yellow paper toward Holmes. "A theatrical boarding house in Southwark. The landlady confirms he returned yesterday evening to collect his belongings, claiming urgent business on the continent. However, she mentioned something most peculiar about his appearance." Holmes scanned the telegram with rapid attention, his gray eyes gleaming with that familiar fire of intellectual challenge accepted. "He altered his appearance, I presume?" "Dramatically so. She said he emerged clean-shaven, whereas he had maintained a full beard throughout his tenancy. His hair appeared darker as well, and his entire bearing seemed transformed. The woman was quite unsettled by the change. "A master of disguise preparing for his final performance," Holmes murmured, moving to our map of London. "Southwark provides easy access to the river docks and the continental routes. Time is now our greatest enemy, Lestrade. What else did your inquiries reveal?" The inspector consulted his notebook with evident satisfaction. "The landlady mentioned that Pendleton left behind a trunk, claiming he would send for it later. My men examined the contents and discovered a Dover boat train timetable with tonight's 8:05 departure marked in pencil." Holmes sprang from his chair with sudden energy. "Excellent work, Inspector. He intends to flee this very evening. We have perhaps 4 hours before his escape becomes irreversible." He began pacing the room with those quick, nervous steps that indicated intense mental activity. "However, we must consider that Pendleton is no ordinary criminal. His theatrical training makes him extraordinarily dangerous when cornered," says blackmailer's final gambit. Our plans were interrupted by the arrival of a street urchin bearing a message addressed directly to Holmes. The boy, clearly well paid for his discretion, vanished into the fog before we could question him. The note, composed in block capitals to disguise the handwriting, read, "Mr. Holmes, your cleverness has been noted. Stop, perhaps we might discuss terms. Stop, certain parties would. Pay handsomely to avoid scandal. Stop Victoria Station 7:30 tonight. Stop, come alone or miss your chance. Stop a mutual friend." Lestrade's face flushed with indignation. "The audacity! He's attempting to blackmail his way out of a murder charge." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, his voice carrying that tone of suppressed excitement I knew so well, "he is providing us with the very opportunity we require. Pendleton believes himself safe because he assumes the locked room mystery remains unsolved. This meeting is his final gambit, to extract money from those who might fear exposure, then disappear forever into continental obscurity. You cannot seriously consider attending this rendezvous," I protested. "It's clearly a trap." "Indeed it is, Watson, but not the trap Pendleton imagines. He expects to meet a detective willing to negotiate, perhaps to accept payment in exchange for selective blindness. Instead, he will encounter someone who understands exactly how his theatrical deception was accomplished." Holmes turned to Lestrade with sudden decisiveness. "Inspector, arrange for plainclothes officers throughout Victoria Station, but they must remain absolutely invisible. Pendleton possesses an actor's trained eye for surveillance. The slightest hint of official presence will send him fleeing into the London labyrinth." Victoria Station, the final stage. The great terminus at evening presented a scene of organized chaos, with steam billowing beneath the high glass roof and crowds of travelers hurrying toward their destinations. Holmes had positioned himself near the Dover train barrier, affecting the casual posture of a gentleman consulting his pocket watch, while I observed from the shadows of the luggage office. The appointed hour approached with agonizing slowness. 7:25, 7:30. 7:35, still no sign of our quarry. Then a commotion near the ticket barrier caught my attention. An elderly woman, heavily veiled and moving with apparent frailty, had stumbled and dropped her reticule, scattering coins across the platform. Holmes moved with surprising swiftness, intercepting the woman as she attempted to retrieve her belongings. "Allow me, madam," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the station noise. As he handed her the bag, his hand closed firmly around her wrist. "The performance is over, Pendleton," Holmes said quietly. "The curtain has fallen on your final act." The transformation was instantaneous and violent. With a snarl of rage that belonged to no elderly lady, the figure wrenched free and shoved Holmes backward. The veil was torn aside to reveal the contorted features of Arthur Pendleton, his eyes wild with the desperation of a cornered animal. "Stop him!" Lestrade shouted, emerging from concealment with his constables. Pendleton bolted toward the open tracks, clearly intending to lose himself in the maze of shunting yards beyond the platform. But his theatrical skills could not overcome the slippery reality of wet metal and moving machinery. As he attempted to vault onto a departing goods train, his foot slipped on the damp step. He fell heavily, and within moments Lestrade's men had surrounded him, dragging him to safety before snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. As we stood over the defeated figure of Arthur Pendleton, Holmes regarded him with that mixture of professional satisfaction and human compassion that characterized his finest moments. "A dramatic exit, Mr. Pendleton, but hardly the one you scripted. Justice, it seems, writes its own final scenes. To be continued in part. Wait. The actor's confession. The interrogation room at Scotland Yard possessed none of the theatrical grandeur that Arthur Pendleton had clearly craved throughout his criminal enterprise. Its bare walls and single gas lamp created harsh shadows that emphasized the defeated slump of his shoulders. As he sat between two constables, his elaborate disguise now completely abandoned. The transformation from desperate fugitive to resigned prisoner had occurred with remarkable swiftness once the handcuffs secured his wrists, stripping away the last vestiges of his theatrical persona. Holmes settled into the chair opposite our captive with deliberate calm, his keen gray eyes studying the man with that peculiar intensity that had unnerved so many criminals before. Inspector Lestrade positioned himself near the door, notebook at the ready, while I took my place slightly behind Holmes, prepared to observe both the questioning and the psychological dynamics that would inevitably unfold. The evidence unveiled. "You possess considerable talent, Mr. Pendleton," Holmes began, his tone conversational rather than accusatory. "Your impersonation of Marcus Whitmore was sufficiently convincing to deceive multiple witnesses, and your understanding of theatrical illusion allowed you to create what appeared to be an impossible crime. Such abilities might have brought you legitimate success had you chosen a different path." Pendleton's laugh carried bitter self-mockery, though something like unease flickered across his features. "Legitimate success? You know nothing of the theatrical profession, Mr. Holmes. Talent matters little when creditors demand payment and managers dismiss you for younger, cheaper alternatives." Holmes produced from his pocket the small envelope containing the horn button we had discovered beneath Miss Ashford's easel. He placed it upon the table between them with deliberate precision. "You are an actor of some talent, Pendleton, but the material world is far less forgiving than the stage. This button belonged to Mr. Whitmore's overcoat, which you were wearing when you visited the studio." "A gifted costumer," Pendleton replied with a faint shrug, though a bead of sweat had appeared at his temple. "And a generous patron who paid me £50 simply to wear his clothing and be seen in his usual haunts while he conducted business in Edinburgh." Holmes's gaze hardened as he spread the police photographs across the table, the enlarged images of Miss Ashford's final painting that revealed the chilling clarity of the reflected scene. "Your charade ceased to be harmless the moment you turned it to murder. You used Whitmore's features, his coat, even his unfortunate history with Miss Ashford, to construct not merely an alibi, but a masterpiece of misdirection. The confession begins." For several moments, Pendleton sat very still, his gaze fixed upon the photographs. When he finally spoke, the bravado had begun to drain from his voice. It was never supposed to happen like that. Whitmore was drowning in debts, facing his creditors. He needed to be seen in London while conducting financial business elsewhere. I was to frequent his usual haunts, maintain visibility in his neighborhood. "When did you first encounter Miss Ashford?" Holmes inquired. Pendleton's expression darkened, and for the first time genuine emotion flickered across his theatrical features. "The third evening of my impersonation. I was walking near Hampstead when I encountered her returning from an errand. She recognized me immediately, or rather, she recognized the man she believed me to be. She confronted me with considerable fury, accused Whitmore of stalking her, of making her life intolerable with his persistent attention. "And you realized that your lucrative arrangement was in jeopardy," Holmes observed. "More than that, Mr. Holmes. If she reported Whitmore's supposed stalking, the police investigation would inevitably expose my impersonation. My creditors would learn of my sudden wealth. The theatrical managers would blacklist me permanently. Everything I had worked to preserve would crumble." The room fell silent, save for the scratching of Lestrade's pencil and the distant sounds of Scotland Yard's evening operations. Pendleton's hands trembled slightly as he continued, the words seeming to flow from some deep reservoir of guilt and desperation. "The fatal encounter. I followed her to her studio, intending only to reason with her, to convince her that no harm was intended. But she refused to listen, threatened to summon the police immediately. In that moment, desperation overwhelmed reason. I seized her throat, meaning only to silence her temporarily, to give myself time to think. But you applied too much force," I interjected, unable to contain my professional assessment. "You rendered her unconscious, and the prolonged pressure caused fatal injury." Pendleton's head dropped into his hands. I panicked when I realized what I had done. My theatrical training took over. I began thinking in terms of staging, of creating a scene that would baffle investigation. I remembered the fishing line technique from a locked room play I had performed years ago. Holmes leaned forward with sudden interest. "The mechanical deception. You had prepared the bolt mechanism in advance." I had studied the studio during my surveillance, noting the door's construction. A simple drill created the necessary hole. I positioned her at the easel, secured the door from the corridor using that method, then fled. Holmes drew from his coat the length of fishing line he had used to demonstrate the technique. "Let us review your performance. After rendering Miss Ashford unconscious, you stepped into the corridor. Closing the door behind you, you passed this line through the keyhole, caught the bolt, and drew it slowly into place. To anyone observing from inside the studio, it would appear that you stood with your hands upon the door itself. The artist's final testament. Yet, you failed to account for Miss Ashford's extraordinary courage and presence of mind." Holmes continued, his voice carrying cold precision. "She regained consciousness as you worked your mechanical trick from the corridor, and she recorded exactly what she observed. Through the mirror, she saw your figure before the door. She saw your arms raised, your white cuffs flashing as you manipulated the invisible line." Pendleton's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "The lilies in the painting. You betray yourself again, Pendleton. Only the killer would know that detail troubled us. There were no lilies in that studio. What she painted as white blossoms were, in fact, your cuffs, distorted by the mirror's bevel and by her weakening vision. In her oxygen-starved state, she interpreted your actions as those of a man who could lock a door by will alone and then walk away from it." A strange, broken sound escaped Pendleton's lips, half laugh, half sob. "She noticed everything. I never imagined she would have the strength to paint, to create such a detailed record. When I learned of the painting's existence, I nearly went mad with fear. But then I realized that her depiction actually supported my deception. It made the crime appear impossible, supernatural, even." Holmes's voice was very cold. "You gambled with a human life, Mr. Pendleton. Like all your other wagers, you lost. Being an artist to her last breath, she recorded this impossible spectacle with the only tools she possessed: brush, pigment, and canvas. Miss Ashford's final painting contains the very evidence needed to prove your guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. The feet-in curtain. Pendleton looked up at last, the final traces of theatrical arrogance burned away by the weight of undeniable evidence. I am not a murderer by nature, Mr. Holmes. I am an actor who made a terrible decision in a moment of panic, then compounded that error with increasingly desperate attempts at concealment. Miss Ashford deserved none of what befell her. Your remorse, while perhaps genuine, cannot undo the crime, Lestrade stated firmly, rising from his chair. Arthur Pendleton, you will be formally charged with the murder of Miss Evangeline Ashford. As the constables led Pendleton away to the cells below, his theatrical bearing had completely vanished, replaced by the shuffling gait of a broken man facing inevitable justice. Holmes watched his departure with an expression that mingled satisfaction at a case successfully concluded with something approaching pity for the waste of talent and potential. Reflection on truth and illusion. A tragic business, Watson, Holmes murmured as we emerged into the cool night air, where the fog had lifted completely to reveal stars shining brightly above the London's rooftops. Talent wasted, lives destroyed, all for the sake of greed and vanity. Yet in the end, truth has a way of asserting itself, even from beyond the grave. Miss Ashford's courage in her final moments was extraordinary, I observed. To maintain such presence of mind, to leave us such a detailed record of what occurred. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. She was extraordinarily brave, Watson. And perhaps her final masterpiece serves as a reminder that the most perfect illusions are often shattered by the simplest of truths. Pendleton created what he believed to be an impossible crime, but Miss Ashford's artistic eye saw through his deception, recording not what he intended her to see, but what actually transpired. The locked room was never truly locked to those who knew how to look. The case of the girl who watched her killer leave was closed, but the memory of Evangeline Ashford's final testament would remain, a silent witness to the triumph of truth over deception and of artistic courage over criminal cunning. To be continued in Part 9. The Brothers' Gratitude. The week following Arthur Pendleton's confession brought with it a gradual return to the familiar rhythms of Baker Street, though the shadow of the Hampstead tragedy continued to cast its influence over our daily proceedings. Holmes had retreated into one of his periods of intense chemical experimentation, filling our sitting room with the acrid smoke of his retorts and the bubbling of mysterious compounds, as though seeking to cleanse his mind through the precision of scientific method. I found myself returning to my medical practice with renewed appreciation for its straightforward certainties after the labyrinthine deceptions we had recently unraveled. It was on a grey Tuesday afternoon, when November's pale sun struggled against the London gloom, that Mrs. Hudson announced the arrival of Leonard Ashford. The gentleman who entered our chambers bore little resemblance to the grief-stricken figure who had first sought our assistance. Though sorrow still marked his features, it had transformed into something quieter and more controlled, the settled melancholy of one who has found meaning within tragedy. Mrs. Holmes, Dr. Watson, he began, his voice steady despite the emotion that clearly moved beneath the surface. I have come directly from Scotland Yard, where Inspector Lestrade provided me with the complete details of Pendleton's confession. I wish to express my profound gratitude for your extraordinary work in bringing this terrible affair to its proper conclusion. Holmes looked up from his microscope, setting aside his instruments with characteristic precision. Your sister's courage provided us with the essential evidence, Mr. Ashford. We merely served as interpreters of what she so bravely recorded in her final moments, the weight of truth. Ashford moved to the fireplace, his hands clasping and unclasping behind his back, in a gesture that spoke of carefully controlled emotion. Lestrade explained the mechanical deception, the fishing line, the drilled hole, the mirror's reflection that made the impossible appear real. To think that such a simple trick nearly allowed a murderer to escape justice entirely. The obvious often remains invisible until properly illuminated, Holmes observed, returning to his chair. Your sister possessed remarkable presence of mind. Despite her dire circumstances, she maintained sufficient artistic discipline to document what she observed with extraordinary precision. That final painting was not merely a work of art, but a testament to human courage under the most extreme duress. I leaned forward with professional interest. From a medical standpoint, her ability to work with such clarity after the initial attack represents the very limits of human endurance. The will to complete that testimony must have been extraordinary. Ashford's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She would have crawled across broken glass to finish a composition once begun. That she should treat her own murder as a work requiring completion. His voice faltered, but he recovered quickly. It transforms my grief into something I can bear with pride, rather than merely endure with sorrow. Practical resolutions. There remains the question of the studio and her other works, Ashford continued, drawing a folded document from his coat. I have been considering how best to honor her memory. The studio itself I cannot bear to close immediately, yet neither can I allow it to remain a shrine to tragedy. Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. You have conceived a plan? I intend to arrange for it to serve as a workspace for other artists. Young women of talent, but limited means who might benefit from access to proper facilities and northern light. Not a formal institution, you understand, but a quiet arrangement that would allow Evangeline's workspace to continue serving art. A fitting memorial, Holmes agreed. Your sister's final work demonstrated that art can serve truth even in the darkest circumstances. How appropriate that her studio should continue to nurture that connection. The painting's fate. Ashford's expression grew troubled as he addressed the most difficult question. The painting itself presents a more complex problem. It will be required as evidence during Pendleton's trial, but afterward its disposition falls to me. I confess uncertainty about how to proceed with such a singular work. Holmes considered this carefully. The painting represents both terrible tragedy and remarkable triumph of human will. Your sister transformed her final moments into testimony that brought her killer to justice. Such a work transcends ordinary considerations of art or evidence. Yet I cannot simply hang it in my drawing room, Ashford said with a slight, bitter smile. Nor can I bear the thought of it becoming a sensation for the morbidly curious. Preserve it, I suggested, but keep it from public exhibition. Future generations may benefit from understanding how courage and artistic skill combined to solve what appeared impossible. However, its primary purpose has been served. Ashford nodded slowly. Yes, I believe that is the proper course. I shall have it stored securely, with instructions that it may be studied by serious investigators or scholars, but never displayed for mere spectacle. Whitmore's redemption. And what of Mr. Whitmore? Holmes inquired. I understand he has been released from custody. The young man's jaw tightened slightly, but the bitter hatred I had observed previously was notably absent. He came to see me yesterday. He is utterly broken, Mr. Holmes. The knowledge that his deceitful scheme led directly to Evangeline's death will punish him far more effectively than any court. He intends to leave England. Australia, I believe, where he hopes honest labor might provide some measure of redemption. Perhaps it shall, Holmes said quietly. London holds nothing for him now but ghosts and recriminations. A man may sometimes find his better nature in exile, particularly when driven by genuine remorse, a token of gratitude. As Ashford prepared to take his leave, he drew a small, carefully wrapped package from his inner pocket. A token of my appreciation, Mr. Holmes. This belonged to my father, a first edition of Poe's Tales of Mystery and Imagination. Evangeline often remarked that you reminded her of Monsieur Dupin. I believe she would have wanted you to have it. Holmes accepted the volume with uncharacteristic reverence, his long fingers tracing the gilt lettering on the leather binding. I am deeply honored, Mr. Ashford. Please know that bringing your sister's killer to justice was its own reward, though the intellectual challenge was stimulating. You gave me more than justice, Ashford replied, extending his hand with evident emotion. You gave me understanding of her final moments, proof of her courage and clarity, even as life ebbed away. That knowledge transforms my loss into something I can carry with dignity. Philosophical reflections. After Ashford's departure, silence settled over our chambers like a comfortable blanket. Holmes had moved to the window, the precious volume still in his hands, gazing out at the endless flow of London life below. I watched him carefully, noting the subtle signs of emotional fatigue that marked the conclusion of our more affecting cases. You know, Watson, he said suddenly without turning from the window, this case demonstrates a fundamental truth about our profession. We often speak of cold logic and scientific deduction, yet in this instance it was human perception, flawed, failing, yet artistically true, that provided the crucial evidence. Miss Ashford did not record objective reality, I observed. She recorded her experience of reality, filtered through art and extremity. Precisely. And in doing so, she gave us something more valuable than mere facts. Holmes finally turned from the window, settling into his chair with the weary satisfaction of a man who has completed difficult but necessary work. She painted her murder, yes, but she also painted her victory over the man who sought to silence her. She watched him leave and ensured that we would watch him return, in chains. He opened the Poe volume carefully, his eyes scanning the familiar tales with evident pleasure. The world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes. Miss Ashford observed them all, even as death approached. We were merely the translators of her final testament. The afternoon light was beginning to fade as Holmes reached for his violin, drawing forth those melancholy notes that invariably marked the end of our more poignant cases. The haunting melody filled the room like a requiem for the girl who watched her killer leave, whose silent testimony had spoken louder than any living witness could have done. The case was closed. The file would join its companions in the tin dispatch boxes. But the memory of that courageous young artist and her impossible painting would remain with us long after the fog had swallowed the streets of London once more. In the gathering dusk, I returned to my notes, determined to preserve not merely the mechanical solution to the locked room mystery, but the deeper truth it revealed about the human spirit's capacity to create meaning and seek justice even in the face of ultimate darkness. Some cases, I reflected, solve more than crimes. They illuminate the very best of what we might hope to be. To be continued in Part 10, The Final Reflection. The weeks following Arthur Pendleton's arrest brought with them a gradual return to the familiar rhythms of Baker Street, though the shadow of the Hampstead tragedy continued to influence our daily proceedings. Holmes had resumed his chemical experiments, filling our sitting room with the acrid smoke of his retorts, while I alternated between my medical practice and the preparation of wool. My written account of the case determined to record every nuance before memory dulled its vivid outlines. It was on a grey December evening, with the fire burning low and the street sounds muffled by a fine mist, that Holmes broke a long silence from his armchair. You have nearly finished your chronicle, Watson. I glanced up from my notebook, unsurprised by his observation. The manner in which I chew my pen when nearing a conclusion is distinctive, I suppose. Among other tells, he replied with a slight smile. You also glanced twice at the dispatch box. That suggests you contemplate adding another file to our completed cases. Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson appeared with the Evening Post, including a letter that would provide our final connection to the Ashford affair. The envelope bore the official seal of the Old Bailey, and its contents confirmed what we had expected. Arthur Pendleton had been found guilty and sentenced to death. His theatrical skills had proven insufficient against the weight of evidence, including that remarkable final painting that had spoken more eloquently than any living witness. Justice has been served, Holmes observed, folding the letter carefully, though I confess to finding little satisfaction in watching a man of talent destroy himself through greed and panic. Pendleton possessed gifts that might have brought legitimate success, yet he chose deception and ultimately violence. The letter also contained an unexpected enclosure from Leonard Ashford, a small sketch that his sister had apparently made during a visit to a nearby client months before her death. The drawing depicted our very sitting room with a remarkable accuracy, showing Holmes by the fireplace and myself at the writing desk. Every detail was precisely rendered, from the Persian slipper to the violin case, demonstrating once again Miss Ashford's extraordinary eye for truth. She saw us as we actually are, I marveled, studying the intimate accuracy of the sketch, not as we might wish to be perceived. The same honesty that characterized her final work. Holmes agreed, positioning the drawing carefully on the mantelpiece. She possessed that rare quality of seeing truly, without the distortions of sentiment or preconception. Such clarity of vision is precious beyond measure. As the evening deepened, Holmes reached for his violin, drawing forth one of those contemplative melodies that invariably mark the conclusion of our more affecting cases. The haunting notes filled the room like a requiem for the girl who had watched her killer leave, whose silent testimony has spoken louder than any living witness could have done. "You know, Watson," he said, lowering his bow, "this case has reminded me that human beings are not merely problems to be solved or puzzles to be unraveled. They possess depths of courage and creativity that transcend rational analysis." When confronted with her own mortality, Miss Ashford chose not despair, but artistic testimony. She transformed her final moments into a work that would speak for her after death. I nodded, remembering that extraordinary painting with its cryptic message and distorted reflections. She trusted that truth, faithfully recorded, would ultimately prevail. Indeed, crime, my dear fellow, is rarely original. Human motives repeat themselves with tiresome regularity. Greed, jealousy, fear, vanity. What gives the appearance of novelty is almost always the method of concealment. In that sense, I battle not so much villains as the stories they construct about their actions. Pendleton created an elaborate illusion, but Miss Ashford's art proved more powerful than his deception. Holmes set aside his violin and moved to the window where the gaslight revealed the endless flow of London life below. "The great city awaits, Watson. New puzzles, new challenges, new labyrinths to navigate. But we shall remember the girl who watched her killer leave. Her courage serves as a reminder that truth, however obscured by deception, possesses an inherent power that ultimately cannot be denied." The fire had burned low as midnight approached, and the familiar sounds of London's nightlife drifted up from the street below. Holmes returned to his chair with that quiet satisfaction that marked the successful conclusion of a complex case. The mystery was solved. The file would join its companions in the dispatch box, but the deeper lessons would remain with us. "File it then, Watson," Holmes said finally, gesturing toward my notebook. "Add it to your catalogue of human drama and detection. Only remember that in this case the cleverest person in the room was not present to hear our explanations." I closed my notebook slowly, understanding his meaning perfectly. Miss Evangeline Ashford had solved her own murder through courage, artistry, and an unwavering commitment to truth. We had merely served as interpreters of her final, extraordinary testament. The case of the girl who watched her killer leave was closed, but its echoes would remain, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can illuminate truth and ensure that justice ultimately prevails. The snow began to fall shortly after dusk on the Friday, following Arthur Pendleton's conviction, transforming Baker Street into a ghostly thoroughfare where gas lamps cast amber halos through the swirling flakes. From our sitting-room window, I watched the great city settle beneath its white shroud, muffling the endless roar of London into contemplative silence. It seemed fitting weather for reflection upon the conclusion of what had proven to be one of our most singular cases. Holmes sat at his desk, methodically updating his commonplace book with newspaper clippings from Pendleton's trial. The Daily Telegraph persisted in sensationalizing the affair as the mystery of the spectral strangler, though the jury had required less than 2 hours to render their verdict of guilty. The mechanical simplicity of the fishing line deception had proven far less compelling to the press than the supernatural impossibility they preferred to imagine. The trial proceeded exactly as anticipated, Holmes remarked, smoothing down a clipping with his thumb. Pendleton's theatrical skills served him poorly under cross-examination. When confronted with Miss Ashford's painting and asked to explain her accurate depiction of his presence, he could offer nothing but stammering denials that convinced no one. A knock at our door interrupted his observations, and Mrs. Hudson soon announced Leonard Ashford, accompanied by a young woman I recognized as Miss Clara Mortlake, a painter of growing reputation. They brought with them a carefully wrapped canvas that proved to be a portrait of Miss Evangeline Ashford, rendered with remarkable sensitivity and strength. Miss Mortlake was Evangeline's final pupil, Ashford explained, his voice steady despite the emotion beneath. We have arranged for the studio to serve other female artists of limited means, and this portrait will hang where that terrible final painting once stood. Not as a shrine to tragedy, but as recognition of what was and what continues. Holmes examined the work with evident interest. Miss Mortlake possesses her own manner, though the Ashford influence is clear in her insistence upon accuracy of observation, the same refusal to flatter, the same commitment to truth. Your sister would approve of such honest remembrance. After our visitors departed, Holmes moved to the fireplace, producing from his pocket the coil of fishing line he had retained from the studio. For a moment he held it up to the light, the thin strand gleaming like a spider's web, fragile yet strong enough to strangle truth itself. A simple thread, he mused, used to bind a door and seal what its user believed would be a perfect tomb. It belongs in the fire, I think. We have no need for such artifacts. The lesson matters, not the tool. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the coil into the heart of the flames. We watched in silence as it curled, blackened, and vanished in a brief flare of green, the physical mechanism of the mystery consumed by heat. I have been contemplating the fragility of justice, Watson, Holmes continued, settling into his chair. Consider the alternative. Had Miss Ashford panicked, had she struggled blindly instead of focusing her fading consciousness on her canvas, Pendleton would be free tonight, spending his gains in Paris while the world remained convinced a phantom had visited Hampstead. Civilization hung upon the steady hand of a dying girl. There is no such thing as a perfect crime, he added quietly, only imperfect deductions. Pendleton constructed a mechanical puzzle, but she responded with human truth. Her final work will outlive both of us, a testament to courage that transcends the crime it helped to solve. He rose and retrieved his violin from its corner case, tucking the instrument beneath his chin with practiced ease. The first low, mournful note resonated through our chambers, a perfect counterpoint to the wind that had begun to moan around the eaves. As the melody swelled with those complex harmonies only Holmes could weave, I settled back into my armchair, listening to music that, unlike human motives, never deceives. The case was finished. The file would join its companions in the tin dispatch box. Pendleton awaited his fate in Newgate, and Miss Ashford's legacy lived on in both justice served and art preserved. Outside, London slept under its white shroud, hiding millions of secrets, waiting for morning to reveal whatever new puzzles might find their way to our door. As if summoned by the thought, the sharp ring of our bell cut through the violin's song. Holmes lowered his bow, eyes brightening with familiar anticipation. You perceive, Watson? Scarcely has one curtain fallen before the prompter calls for the next. Let us see what drama the city has devised for our entertainment tonight. The case of the girl who watched her killer leave had reached its end, but its lesson, that truth faithfully recorded possesses power no deception can ultimately overcome, would travel with us into whatever mystery awaited beyond our door. The weeks following Arthur Pendleton's execution brought with them a curious mixture of satisfaction and melancholy that seemed to permeate our Baker Street chambers like the persistent London fog. Holmes had returned to his chemical experiments and monographs, yet I often caught him gazing at Miss Ashford's sketch upon our mantelpiece with an expression that suggested deeper contemplation than his usual analytical detachment. It was during one such moment of quiet reflection that he broke a lengthy silence with characteristic directness. "You have been uncommonly thorough in your notes regarding the Ashford case, Watson. More so than usual." I glanced up from my manuscript, unsurprised by his observation. "The case demanded careful documentation. Miss Ashford's courage deserves accurate remembrance." "Indeed. Yet you have also recorded something I had not fully appreciated until reading your account." Holmes moved from the window to settle in his familiar chair. "You documented not merely my deductions, but the collective nature of our investigation. Your medical insights regarding the impossibility of her securing the door after the attack, Lestrade's methodical gathering of evidence, even Leonard Ashford's knowledge of his sister's habits, all contributed essential elements. This observation struck me as particularly significant. You suggest that detection is not the province of a single mind. I suggest that truth emerges from honest observation regardless of its source. Miss Ashford demonstrated this principle in its purest form. She recorded precisely what she witnessed, trusting that others would interpret her testimony correctly. In that sense, she was our colleague, a fellow seeker of truth who used pigment and canvas where we employ logic and deduction." Holmes reached for his pipe, beginning the familiar ritual that often preceded his most profound observations. "Crime seeks to obscure truth through deception and misdirection. Our role is to illuminate what has been deliberately darkened. Miss Ashford accomplished this even as life ebbed from her, creating a testament that transcended the circumstances of its creation." Before I could respond, our contemplation was interrupted by the urgent ringing of our doorbell. Mrs. Hudson soon appeared, announcing Inspector Lestrade, who entered bearing the harried expression that invariably accompanied his most perplexing cases. "Gentlemen, I require your immediate assistance," he began without preamble. "We have a most extraordinary situation in Belgravia. A diamond necklace worth £20,000 has vanished from a locked safe in Lady Pemberton's drawing room. The safe remains unopened, the combination known only to her ladyship, yet the jewels have disappeared as completely as if they had never existed." Holmes's eyes immediately sharpened with that familiar gleam of intellectual hunger. "Another impossible crime, Inspector? London seems particularly afflicted with such mysteries of late." "The circumstances are most peculiar, Mr. Holmes. Lady Pemberton discovered the theft this evening when preparing for the opera. The safe shows no signs of tampering, yet inside she found only this." Lestrade produced a small card bearing an elegant script. "Truth, like diamonds, requires proper illumination to reveal its full brilliance." I felt a chill of recognition at those words, so reminiscent of Miss Ashford's final painting and its cryptic message. Holmes rose with sudden energy, reaching for his coat and magnifying glass. "Watson, your service revolver and medical bag, if you please." "It appears our education in impossible crimes continues." He paused at the mantelpiece, his fingers touching Miss Ashford's sketch one final time. "She taught us that the impossible merely awaits proper interpretation. Let us see if Lady Pemberton's empty safe yields its secrets as readily as that locked studio in Hampstead." As we descended to the waiting hansom, the evening mist was beginning to thicken, transforming London once again into that familiar labyrinth of shadows and mystery. Yet I carried with me the lesson of Evangeline Ashford, that truth faithfully recorded possesses an enduring power that transcends the circumstances of its creation. "You know, Watson," Holmes said as our cab rattled toward Belgravia, "each case we undertake honors those who can no longer speak for themselves. Miss Ashford's courage in documenting her own murder reminds us that our profession serves something greater than intellectual satisfaction. We give voice to the silenced and clarity to the obscured." The great city stretched before us, vast and unknowable, containing within its streets countless mysteries waiting to be unraveled. But tonight, as we rode to Aude, our new puzzle, I understood that we carried with us the memory of a young artist who had refused to let death silence her testimony. Her final painting would endure long after we were gone. a testament to the power of truth and the indomitable courage of the human spirit when confronted with darkness. The game was indeed afoot, but it was a game with meaning that transcended mere puzzle-solving. We sought justice for those who could no longer seek it themselves.